I walked into that church on a Saturday afternoon in June, carrying 63 years of showing up when I was needed. The sanctuary at Mount Zion Baptist in Richmond held 400 people when the pews were full, and that day every seat was taken. My granddaughter, Alicia, was marrying into the Patterson family, and both sides had turned out in their finest. The women in hats that cost more than some people's rent, the men in custom suits that whispered money without saying a word. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing our family from all around the world come together. Thank you for being here and sharing your time with us. I had been part of Mount Zion for 41 years. I'd served on every committee that mattered, organized the anniversary celebrations when Pastor Hollis reached 25 years, coordinated the repast after Sister Morrison passed, and sat in that same third pew every Sunday morning since 1984. When people needed wisdom about church politics or family disputes, they came to me. When the deacons couldn't agree, I was the one they called to broker peace. I never asked for recognition. I simply understood that certain women hold communities together through decades of quiet, consistent presence. My mother had been that kind of woman too. She'd raised 7 children in a 3-bedroom house in Petersburg, worked as a seamstress, and somehow always had room at her table for whoever needed feeding. I watched her navigate family feuds with the same calm I'd later use myself, never taking sides, always finding the thread that could pull people back together. She taught me that a woman's power often lives in what she doesn't say, in the space she holds for others to find their way back to sense. When she passed in 1998, half of Petersburg showed up to her funeral. The pastor spoke for 20 minutes about her quiet influence. Not one person mentioned that she'd never held an official title in anything. I learned from watching her what happens when you make yourself indispensable without ever demanding recognition. People come to depend on your steadiness the way they depend on the ground beneath their feet. Necessary, constant, and completely taken for granted until it's gone. I'd married young, at 22, to a man named Thomas who worked for the railroad and had gentle hands and a laugh that filled rooms. We had 41 years together before his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper at our kitchen table. He'd been a good husband, the kind who actually listened when I spoke, and never made me feel small for having opinions. We raised 2 children in that house, Renee first, then Michael 3 years later. I worked as a secretary at the county office during those years, keeping our family fed and clothed, while Thomas dealt with the railroad's unpredictable schedule and the quiet indignities that came with being a black man working for white supervisors who thought his 30 years of experience meant less than their 30 days. I remember the times Thomas would come home with his jaw tight, that particular tension that meant someone had disrespected him and he'd had to swallow it to keep his job. I learned to make space for that anger without letting it consume our home. I learned to be the soft place he could land without becoming so soft I disappeared. It was a delicate balance, being strong enough to hold everything together while making it look effortless enough that no one noticed the effort. When the children were young, I was the one who showed up to every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every moment that required a parent's presence. Thomas worked the routes that kept us stable, and I worked the spaces between his absences. Renee needed help with a science project at the last minute. I stayed up until 3 a.m. building a model of the solar system. Michael got suspended for fighting a boy who'd called him a name I won't repeat. I sat with the principal and negotiated a solution that didn't go on his permanent record. The PTA needed someone to coordinate the spring fundraiser. I organized it while working full-time and managing a household. No one gave me certificates for any of it. No one put my name on programs or made speeches about my contributions. I was just a mother doing what mothers do, which is another way of saying I was invisible in the way women often are when they're doing the most important work. The pattern continued when I became a grandmother. Renee had Alicia when she was 26, and I was the one who showed up in the hospital at 2 a.m. when Renee's water broke and her husband was out of town. I was the one who stayed for 3 weeks after the birth, cooking and cleaning and teaching Renee how to breastfeed when she was crying from exhaustion and pain. I was the one who kept Alicia every weekend for the first year so Renee could sleep and remember she was a person beyond being someone's mother. When Alicia was 4 and Renee's marriage started falling apart, I was the one who created stability in the chaos. I picked Alicia up from daycare on the days Renee couldn't manage it. I kept her for entire weeks when the divorce was being finalized and Renee needed time to find herself again. I taught Alicia to read, to tie her shoes, to say her prayers before bed. I gave her the kind of steady love that doesn't waver based on circumstances. Alicia grew up knowing I was her safe place. She came to my house after school, sat at my kitchen table doing homework while I cooked dinner, told me about her friends and her fears and her dreams. When she was 16 and dealing with a boy who wouldn't leave her alone, she called me instead of her mother. When she was applying to colleges and feeling overwhelmed, she showed up at my door at 10 o'clock at night, asking me to help her think through her choices. I gave her what I'd always given everyone, my time, my attention, my wisdom offered without expectation of return. Mount Zion became another place where I practiced that same kind of invisible service. I joined the church in 1984, right after Thomas and I bought the house on Forest Avenue. Pastor Hollis was new then, young and full of energy, and he was trying to build something that honored the old traditions while bringing in fresh ideas. I started with the hospitality committee, which meant showing up early to make coffee and arrange cookies for after service. Simple work that nobody noticed unless it wasn't done. But I noticed how things worked at Mount Zion. I noticed when Sister Crawford and Sister Jenkins stopped speaking to each other over a disagreement about the choir robes. I noticed when Deacon Morris was struggling with his son's addiction and couldn't focus on his responsibilities. I noticed when the youth ministry was falling apart because 2 families were fighting over whose child should lead it. I noticed, and I stepped into the spaces where people needed someone to quietly fix things. Sister Crawford and Sister Jenkins ended up in my living room on a Wednesday afternoon. I served them tea and let them talk until they were tired of hearing themselves. Then I asked them if they remembered why they'd joined the choir in the first place. They reconciled without anyone at church knowing they'd ever been at my house. Deacon Morris came to me when he needed advice about how to talk to his son. I connected him with a counselor I knew through community work and never mentioned it to anyone. The youth ministry situation got resolved when I suggested a co-leadership structure that gave both families what they needed, recognition for their children without the power struggle. Pastor Hollis started calling me when he had delicate situations that needed handling. A family was falling apart over an inheritance dispute. He asked me to mediate. A long-standing church member was being quietly edged out by newer members who didn't understand her value. He asked me to find a way to restore balance. 2 deacons were in conflict over how to handle church finances. He asked me to facilitate a conversation that wouldn't end in public confrontation. I did all of it without title or position. I was never an officer, never sat on the deacon board, never had my name in the church directory under leadership. I was simply Margaret Harrison, the woman in the 3rd pew who somehow helped keep things running smoothly. People brought their problems to my house the way they brought their offerings to church, regularly, with a kind of faith that I'd know what to do. The year Thomas died, Mount Zion held me together in ways I couldn't hold myself. Sisters from the church brought food for weeks. Deacon Morris sat with me in my living room and let me cry without trying to fix it with scripture or platitudes. Pastor Hollis preached Thomas's funeral with the kind of reverence that told everyone in that sanctuary that my husband had mattered. The church gave me space to grieve and time to find my feet again. I came back to my role slowly. It took 6 months before I could sit through a service without crying. It took a year before I could help mediate other people's conflicts without feeling like my own grief was too heavy to carry while holding space for theirs. But I came back because that's what you do. You return to the work of keeping things together even when you feel broken yourself. By the time Alicia was planning her wedding, I'd spent nearly 2 decades being Mount Zion's unofficial peacemaker. I'd helped resolve probably 30 or 40 family disputes, church conflicts, and community tensions. I'd talked people down from anger, helped them see past their hurt, and created space for reconciliation that preserved dignity on all sides. I'd done it all quietly, privately, without any need for public acknowledgement. I thought that was enough. I thought the work itself was the reward. I thought showing up consistently, offering wisdom freely, and serving without recognition was how you honored the legacy my mother had given me. Alicia had asked me to help plan the wedding 6 months earlier. She came to my house on a Tuesday evening, sat at my kitchen table where she'd done homework as a child, and said she wanted me involved in everything. She knew the Pattersons would have opinions. They always did. But she wanted her grandmother's touch on the day that mattered most. I agreed, because that's what you do when you love someone. I spent weeks coordinating with the florist, reviewing the program, selecting scriptures for the ceremony, and working with the reception venue to ensure every detail reflected both families with equal dignity. The Pattersons had different ideas. Veronica Patterson, the groom's mother, arrived at our planning meetings with folders and spreadsheets. She spoke over people mid-sentence and treated vendors like servants. I watched her redirect decisions I'd already finalized, always with a smile that suggested she was simply being helpful. When I mentioned that Mount Zion had specific protocols for wedding ceremonies, she nodded and then ignored everything I said. When I suggested the traditional receiving line that honored both families, she scheduled a cocktail hour that left the bride's side standing awkwardly in the fellowship hall. I didn't argue. Women my age understand that some battles aren't worth the breath they cost. I continued showing up to meetings, offering suggestions that were politely dismissed, and watching Alicia's vision for her day get transformed into something that belonged more to Veronica than to her. My daughter Renee noticed. She pulled me aside after one particularly frustrating session and asked why I was letting Veronica run over me. I told her the same thing my mother told me. You can't control other people's character, only your response to it. I'd lived that principle for decades. When Thomas's supervisor passed him over for a promotion he'd earned, I watched him swallow the bitterness and keep working. When Renee's ex-husband tried to reduce his child support, I helped her navigate the legal system without losing herself to anger. When Michael's business partner tried to push him out of their company, I counseled patience and strategic thinking over confrontation. I'd built a life on the belief that dignity was something you maintained by not descending to other people's level. But there's a difference between choosing not to fight and being erased. I was learning that difference in real time. 3 weeks before the wedding, Veronica sent out the ceremony program for final review. I opened the PDF on my computer and scrolled through 12 pages of formatted text. The wedding party was listed with detailed descriptions. The parents were acknowledged with full paragraphs about their contributions. The grandparents were mentioned in a single line at the bottom of page 7. The families wished to thank all grandparents for their love and support. My name wasn't there, not in the processional, not in the family recognition, not anywhere. I sat at my dining room table and read that program 3 times. I had coordinated half the logistics for that wedding. I had spent hours on the phone with Reverend Williams discussing the ceremony structure. I had personally visited 8 florists before finding the woman who understood exactly what Alicia wanted. I had written the first draft of the program Veronica was now distributing with my contributions erased. The table where I sat had been Thomas's and mine for 37 years. We'd eaten thousands of meals there, paid bills, helped children with homework, celebrated birthdays, mourned losses. I'd sat at that table the morning after he died, staring at his empty chair and wondering how I'd ever eat breakfast alone for the rest of my life. I'd sat there when Renee got divorced, when Michael's business nearly failed, when Alicia graduated from college. That table had held my life through every season that mattered. And now I sat there holding a wedding program that had removed me from one of those seasons as if I'd never existed. I called Alicia that evening. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with wedding excitement. I asked her if she'd seen the program. She said yes, that Veronica had sent it to her that afternoon. I asked if she noticed anything missing. There was a pause, the kind that told me she knew exactly what I meant and had been hoping I wouldn't mention it. She said Veronica had suggested streamlining the family acknowledgments to keep the program concise. She said it wasn't personal. She said everyone knew how much I'd done and how much I meant to her. She said she hoped I understood. I told her I understood perfectly. Then I wished her a beautiful wedding and ended the call. I didn't cry. I didn't call Veronica. I didn't send angry messages to the family group chat. I simply sat in my living room and felt the particular kind of hurt that comes from being disappeared while you're still breathing. It's one thing to be excluded from something you had no part in. It's another to be written out of something you built with your own hands. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about all the times I'd been invisible. The PTA meetings where I'd done the work while other parents got the credit. The church conflicts I'd resolved without anyone knowing I'd been involved. The family gatherings where I'd cooked and cleaned and managed logistics while others enjoyed themselves and never offered to help. The decades of showing up early, staying late, doing what needed to be done without waiting for thanks. I thought about my mother's funeral, how the pastor had spoken about her quiet influence. I'd been proud of her then, proud that she'd lived a life of service that people recognized after she was gone. But lying there in the dark at 63 years old, I wondered if recognition after you're dead was enough. I wondered if a lifetime of being taken for granted was actually something to be proud of, or if it was just a prettier way of describing being used. Thomas used to tell me I needed to speak up more. He'd see me biting my tongue when someone dismissed my ideas or took credit for my work, and he'd ask why I let people treat me that way. I always said the same thing. The work mattered more than the recognition. But Thomas would shake his head and say sometimes the work only mattered because I was doing it. And if I let people believe it happened by magic, they'd never value the person making the magic happen. I hadn't understood what he meant then. I understood it now. Renee called the next morning. She'd seen the program and was furious. She wanted to confront Veronica, pull Alicia aside, make sure everyone knew what had happened. I told her to do nothing. The wedding was in 3 weeks, and I would not be the woman who caused family drama over a printed program, Renee argued. I listened until she was finished, then told her my decision was final. But something had shifted in me. Something that had been holding all the pieces together for 63 years had quietly come loose. I felt it in my chest, a kind of release, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of my body. I attended the wedding. I wore the dress I'd bought for the occasion. Deep purple silk with a fitted jacket, the kind of outfit that said I belonged in any room I entered. I sat in the third pew with Renee and my son Michael and watched Alicia walk down the aisle. She was beautiful. The ceremony was beautiful. Everything Veronica had planned looked perfect. When the Reverend asked the families to stand and affirm their support for the marriage, I stood with everyone else. I watched Veronica stand in the front row, radiating satisfaction. I watched the Pattersons take up their designated space like they'd purchased it. I watched my family scattered across 3 pews, smiling and emotional and completely unaware that I'd been erased from the official record of that day. At the reception, I moved through the crowd with practiced grace. I hugged relatives I hadn't seen in years. I complimented the centerpieces and the food and the band. When people asked if I'd helped plan the event, I smiled and said Veronica had done a wonderful job. I didn't elaborate. I didn't correct anyone. I simply let the day unfold exactly as it had been designed, without my name attached to any of it. Sister Jenkins from church found me near the punch bowl. She was wearing a magnificent hat, purple and gold with feathers that moved when she talked. She pulled me aside and said she'd noticed my name wasn't in the program. She said she knew I'd done half the planning and it wasn't right that I hadn't been acknowledged. I thanked her for noticing and changed the subject. but her words stayed with me. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen the work I'd done and recognized the absence of my name. It was a small thing, but it reminded me that invisibility isn't always about whether people can see you. Sometimes it's about whether they're willing to acknowledge what they see. Alicia found me near the end of the reception. She hugged me tightly and thanked me for coming. She said the day had been perfect. I told her I was happy for her. She asked if I was okay, her voice dropping to that careful tone people use when they know they've hurt you but hope you won't say it out loud. I told her I was fine. She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded and returned to her new husband. I left before the sparkler exit. I drove home through Richmond's evening streets and parked in my driveway and walked into my house that had been mine for 37 years. I made tea. I sat in my favorite chair, the one Thomas had bought me for my 50th birthday, deep green velvet that had faded to a softer shade over the years. I thought about all the years I'd spent showing up for other people's important moments, holding space, smoothing conflicts, making sure everyone felt valued and seen. I thought about how easy it had been for Veronica to erase me and how quickly Alicia had accepted it. Then I decided I was finished. The decision didn't come with lightning or revelation. It came quietly, the way most important decisions do when you've lived long enough to know your own mind. I simply sat in that chair and understood that I no longer needed to make myself available to people who only valued my presence when they needed something from me. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't write letters or make phone calls. I simply stopped being available in the ways I had always been available. When Alicia called 3 weeks after the wedding to ask if I wanted to meet for lunch, I told her I was busy. When she called again 2 weeks later, I was busy again. When Renee asked why I wasn't returning Alicia's calls, I said I'd been occupied with other things. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I just continued living my life with one less person in it. The first few months were harder than I expected. I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to call Alicia about something I'd seen that made me think of her. I'd be at the grocery store and see the cookies she loved and almost buy them before remembering there was no reason to. I'd hear a song we used to sing together when she was little and feel the loss sharp in my chest. But I didn't reach out. I'd spent 63 years reaching out first, showing up without invitation, making myself available without reciprocation. I was done initiating relationships with people who only remembered I existed when they wanted something. The Patterson family held their gatherings without me. Alicia posted pictures from Sunday dinners at Veronica's house, from holiday celebrations, from baby showers for her new sisters-in-law. I scrolled past them on my phone with the same mild interest I gave to acquaintances I barely knew. Renee worried I was being too harsh. I told her I wasn't being harsh at all. I was simply respecting the family structure Veronica had established. If I wasn't important enough to acknowledge publicly, I didn't need to participate privately. Church became different too. People still came to me with their problems, but I started saying no. When Sister Crawford asked me to mediate a dispute with her daughter, I suggested she talk to Pastor Hollis. When Deacon Morris wanted help navigating a conflict on the finance committee, I told him the deacons needed to handle it themselves. When Pastor Hollis called asking me to facilitate a conversation between two feuding families, I said I was stepping back from that kind of work. I could hear the surprise in people's voices when I declined. For decades, I'd been the woman who never said no, who always had time, who could always be counted on to step into difficult situations. Now I was drawing boundaries, and people didn't know how to process it. Pastor Hollis came to visit me on a Thursday afternoon. He sat in my living room, accepted the coffee I offered, and asked if everything was all right. I told him everything was fine. He said people had noticed I wasn't participating in mediation work anymore, and he was concerned. I asked him if he thought I'd earned a retirement from that particular form of service. He paused, then admitted he'd never thought about it that way. I told him I was 73 years old and I'd spent enough years solving other people's problems. It was time for other people to develop those skills. He asked if something had happened to change my perspective. I considered telling him about the wedding, about Alicia, about spending decades being invisible until someone needed me. Instead, I said that time changes. Everyone's priorities and mine had shifted. He accepted that, though I could see the questions in his eyes that he was too polite to ask. After he left, I sat in that same chair and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to be the person everyone called. Relief that I could spend my time on things that brought me joy rather than on managing other people's conflicts. Relief that I'd finally given myself permission to live a smaller life that belonged entirely to me. Months became a year. I filled my time with other things. I joined a book club with women from church who appreciated thoughtful conversation. We met every other Wednesday, discussed everything from Toni Morrison to contemporary mysteries, and nobody expected me to mediate when we disagreed about interpretations. I was just Margaret, one member of a group who all brought different perspectives and equal value. I volunteered at the community center, teaching younger women about financial planning and home ownership. Many of them were single mothers, working multiple jobs, trying to build stability for their children. I shared what I'd learned from managing our household budget when Thomas was alive, from buying our house, from navigating the financial challenges of raising children. They listened with an attention that felt different from the way people had sought my counsel before. They weren't coming to me to fix their problems. They were coming to learn skills that would help them fix their own. I took a pottery class at the Art Center and discovered I had a talent for working with clay. There was something meditative about centering the clay on the wheel, feeling it respond to pressure, shaping it into something functional and beautiful. My instructor, a woman named Patricia, who'd moved to Richmond from Atlanta, said I had natural ability. I made bowls and plates and mugs, each one imperfect in ways that made them interesting. I gave some away, kept others, and felt proud of creating something that existed simply because I wanted it to exist, not because someone needed it from me. I traveled to Savannah to visit my cousin Dorothy, spent a week in Charleston walking through history, drove to Durham for a long weekend with college friends I hadn't seen in years. These were women I'd known when we were young, before marriage and children and responsibility had shaped us into who we became. We sat on Dorothy's porch in Savannah and talked about our lives, the choices we'd made, the things we'd sacrificed, the ways we'd learned to take care of ourselves after spending decades taking care of everyone else. Dorothy had been widowed too, 6 years before Thomas died. She told me it had taken her 3 years to stop feeling guilty about enjoying her independence. She said her children had expected her to be available for babysitting whenever they needed it. And when she started saying no, they'd acted like she was being selfish. I asked her what changed. She said she'd realized that being a good mother didn't mean sacrificing herself until there was nothing left. Her children had adjusted. They'd learned to value her time instead of assuming it was theirs to claim. I thought about that conversation for weeks after I returned home. I thought about how women my age were supposed to exist in service to younger generations, how we were expected to pour everything we had into our children and grandchildren without expecting anything in return. I thought about how quickly that service became invisible, how easily contribution became expectation, how naturally gratitude disappeared when someone was always there. I didn't miss the obligations. I didn't miss the phone calls asking me to mediate disputes or offer advice or show up to events where my presence was expected but not valued. I had spent decades being the person everyone needed. It turned out I didn't need to be that person anymore. Alicia's first pregnancy was announced on social media. I saw the post, her and her husband holding a tiny pair of shoes, both of them glowing with joy. Renee called to tell me the news, her voice careful, waiting for my reaction. I said congratulations and meant it. When she asked if I planned to reach out to Alicia, I said I was sure Alicia had plenty of support from the Patterson family. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said Alicia had been asking about me, wondering if I was still upset about the wedding. I told Renee I wasn't upset at all. I was simply living my life the same way Alicia was living hers, surrounded by the people who mattered most to me. The truth was more complicated than that. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy, and I'd stopped spending energy on people who didn't reciprocate it. What I felt was something closer to peace, the kind that comes from accepting reality and choosing your response to it. Alicia had made clear where I ranked in her priorities. I was responding accordingly. The baby shower was held at Veronica's house. I wasn't invited. Renee said it was an oversight, that Veronica had probably assumed I wouldn't want to come. I told Renee she was probably right. Michael called later that week and suggested I was taking things too far. I asked him if he remembered sitting in that church watching his daughter get married while his mother was written out of the program. He went quiet. Then he said he understood. But I don't think he did understand. Not really. Men often don't understand the particular way women are expected to show up endlessly while being perpetually overlooked. Michael had never been asked to sacrifice his ambitions for family obligations. He'd never been expected to solve everyone's problems while getting no credit for the solutions. He'd never had his contributions erased from a program after spending months doing the work. He could sympathize with my hurt, but he couldn't fully grasp the weight of being invisible for decades. The baby arrived in March, a boy they named Christopher. I sent a gift through the mail, a handmade quilt I'd spent 6 weeks creating, each square carefully chosen and stitched. I'd started it the day Alicia announced the pregnancy, working on it in the evenings while I watched television or listened to audiobooks. The pattern was traditional, a variation on the log cabin design my mother had taught me when I was young. The colors were soft blues and greens with cream accents, suitable for a baby boy, but sophisticated enough to last beyond infancy. I'd made quilts for both my children when they were born, and for Alicia too. Each one had taken weeks of careful work, hand-stitched with prayers for the child who'd sleep beneath it. This quilt for Christopher was no different in quality, but the feelings that went into it were more complicated. I wanted him to have something made by his great-grandmother's hands, even if he grew up not knowing me. I wanted there to be evidence that I'd existed in his life, even if only as the person who'd sent a beautiful quilt when he was born. I included a card with a simple message: "Congratulations on your beautiful son." I didn't ask to visit, I didn't request pictures, I didn't insert myself into their joy. I simply sent the gift and returned to my life. Renee told me Alicia cried when she opened the gift. She told me Alicia had called asking why I wouldn't come see the baby, why I was being so distant, why I couldn't just forgive and move on. Renee said Alicia didn't understand how deep the hurt went. I said nothing. What was there to say? I had shown up for 63 years, and when it mattered most, my showing up hadn't mattered at all. The months after Christopher's birth were quiet. I established new rhythms in my life that didn't include making space for Alicia's family. I spent Sunday afternoons at the botanical gardens, walking through seasonal displays and sitting on benches reading books I'd meant to get to for years. I took a watercolor class and discovered I enjoyed painting flowers and landscapes, though I had no particular talent for it. I volunteered at the library's literacy program, helping adults learn to read with the same patience I'd once used, helping Alicia with her homework. I made new friends, women from my pottery class, my book club, the community center. These were relationships that existed for their own sake, not because we needed things from each other. We had coffee because we enjoyed the conversation. We took day trips together because we wanted the company. We shared our lives without keeping score of who'd done more or given more or shown up more consistently. One of these women, Diane, had her own story about learning to stop being endlessly available. Her daughter had expected free childcare 5 days a week while she worked, then gotten angry when Diane started traveling and wasn't available anymore. Diane said the hardest part was accepting that her daughter might never understand why having a life beyond being a grandmother mattered. She said she'd chosen her own peace over her daughter's approval, and most days that felt like the right choice. I understood exactly what she meant. There was grief in accepting that Alicia might never grasp what she'd done. might never see how casually she'd dismissed someone who'd been essential to her entire life. But there was also freedom in releasing the need for that understanding. I didn't need Alicia to validate my hurt or acknowledge her role in it. I just needed to live differently than I'd lived before. Christopher was 6 months old when the news arrived. Veronica's brother had passed away, leaving a complicated estate that included property in Richmond and investments in Charlotte and a business partnership that nobody had properly documented. The family was fracturing over inheritance questions. Veronica needed someone who understood family dynamics, who had credibility with all sides, who could mediate without taking positions. She needed someone the extended Patterson family trusted and respected. She needed me. I learned about the situation from Sister Jenkins, who'd heard about it from her cousin who worked with one of Veronica's sisters. She mentioned it casually after church, saying she'd heard the Pattersons were having terrible family problems over an estate and things were getting ugly. I made appropriate, sympathetic noises and changed the subject. But I thought about it later, sitting in my living room with my evening tea. I thought about how Veronica had spent months dismissing my input during the wedding planning, how she'd erased my contributions from the program, how she'd treated me like I was irrelevant. I thought about how families in crisis always reached for the same people, the ones who'd proven they could handle difficult conversations, who knew how to find common ground, who could be trusted to put the family's well-being above personal feelings. I thought about all the times I'd stepped into exactly this kind of situation. The Williams family fighting over their mother's house after she passed. The Thompsons torn apart by accusations and resentment after their father's will favored one child over another. The Mitchells barely speaking to each other over business decisions that had gone wrong. I'd helped mediate all of them, spending hours in living rooms and church offices, listening to hurt feelings and old grievances, finding the threads that could pull people back together. I'd done it because I believed family mattered more than money, more than pride, more than being right. I'd done it because I was good at seeing all sides, at holding space for anger while gently redirecting it toward resolution. I'd done it because people asked me to, and I'd never learned how to say no to someone who genuinely needed help. But sitting there in my living room, older and wiser and more tired than I'd been during any of those previous mediations, I realized I didn't have to do it anymore. The skill was still there. The ability hadn't disappeared. But the willingness to spend myself on behalf of people who'd never valued me had gone completely. Alicia called on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my pottery studio working on a series of bowls I planned to donate to the church fundraiser. I let the call go to voicemail. She called again an hour later. I finished my work, cleaned my tools, and listened to both messages while I made dinner. Her voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before. She said Veronica was overwhelmed with the estate situation. She said the family was fighting and relationships were breaking down. She said they needed someone with wisdom and experience to help facilitate conversations. She said she'd told Veronica that I was the obvious person to help. She said Veronica agreed and hoped I would consider getting involved. She said she knew things had been distant between us. She said she understood if I was still upset about the wedding. She said she hoped we could move past it because family was more important than old hurts. She said they really needed me. I listened to both messages twice. I heard the desperation under the careful words. I heard the assumption that I would help because I always helped, because that's what I did. Because surely I wouldn't let family conflict continue when I had the ability to stop it. I deleted both voicemails and went back to my dinner. Alicia called again the next day. I didn't answer. She sent a text asking if we could meet in person to talk. I didn't respond. She called Renee, who called me and asked what I planned to do. I said I planned to continue with my life exactly as it was. Renee said the family genuinely needed help. I said the Patterson family had abundant resources, and I was confident they'd figure it out. Renee pressed. She said I was the only person who could bring the family back together. She said my experience and wisdom were exactly what the situation required. She said sometimes you had to be the bigger person and help, even when you'd been hurt. I asked her if being the bigger person meant spending the rest of my life making myself available to people who'd made clear they didn't value me. She didn't have an answer for that. A week later, Veronica called directly. I was surprised to see her name on my screen. I answered because I was curious about what she would say. Her voice had the same commanding tone I remembered from the wedding planning, but underneath it was something I'd never heard before: desperation. She said she hoped I was well. She said Alicia had mentioned I might be willing to help with the estate situation. She said she understood I had expertise in family mediation and wondered if I'd be available for a consultation. I let her finish. Then I asked if she remembered my name. There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her voice was careful. She said of course she remembered my name. I asked her to spell it. She did, stumbling over the middle initial. I asked her if she remembered including my name in Alicia's wedding program. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. I said I appreciated her call, but I was no longer available for family consultations. I said I was sure she'd find someone else qualified to help. I wished her the best with the estate situation. Then I ended the call. She called back immediately. I didn't answer. She called again an hour later. I didn't answer. She sent a text message apologizing for any oversight regarding the wedding and asking if we could discuss this situation as adults. I deleted the text without responding. The word oversight stayed with me. It was such a small word for such a complete erasure, as if accidentally leaving my name off the program was the same as accidentally forgetting to buy milk at the store. As if months of dismissing my input and erasing my contributions could be reduced to an oversight that required nothing more than a casual apology. I'd lived long enough to know that some people never understood the impact of their actions. Veronica genuinely believed that a quick apology could fix what she'd broken, that acknowledging an oversight was the same as respecting someone's value. She didn't understand that you can't unring a bell, can't unfeel the hurt of being disappeared, can't restore trust by simply deciding it would be convenient to do so. Alicia showed up at my house the following Sunday. I was working in my garden when she pulled into the driveway. Christopher strapped into his car seat in the back. I stood up, brushed the soil from my knees, and waited. She got out of the car carrying the baby. He was beautiful. Big eyes and round cheeks, and that new baby smell that makes you forget everything else for a moment. She walked across my lawn and stopped a few feet away. She said she was sorry. She said she'd made a mistake letting Veronica control the wedding program. She said she should have stood up for me. She said she'd been young and overwhelmed and hadn't understood how much it would hurt me. She said she loved me and missed me and wanted her son to know his great-grandmother. I looked at her, holding that baby. I looked at this young woman who carried my blood and my name in my mother's eyes. I felt the pull of every grandmother instinct I possessed, telling me to forgive, to let it go, to choose family over pride. Then I remembered sitting at my dining room table reading that program. I remembered being disappeared. I remembered spending months trying to reach out only to be met with casual dismissal. I remembered being needed only when I was useful. I told her I appreciated her apology. I told her Christopher was beautiful. I told her I hoped she'd build a wonderful life with her husband and his family. Then I told her I needed to finish my gardening before the sun got too high. She stood there for a long moment holding her baby, waiting for me to invite her inside. I turned back to my roses and resumed pruning. I heard her car door close. I heard her drive away. My hands were shaking when I set down the pruning shears. I sat on the garden bench Thomas had built years ago and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back: the sadness, the loss, the grief for a relationship that had mattered deeply to me, but apparently not enough to her. I let myself cry in a way I hadn't cried since Thomas died, deep sobs that came from somewhere ancient and wounded, but underneath the grief was something solid, the knowledge that I'd made the right choice. Alicia had apologized because she needed something, not because she'd genuinely reckoned with what she'd done. If the Patterson family wasn't in crisis, She wouldn't have been standing in my yard with her baby. The apology was conditional on my usefulness, and I was done being useful to people who didn't value me. Renee called that evening, angry and confused. She said I was being cruel. She said Alicia had apologized. She said I was going to regret pushing away my great-grandson over something that happened 2 years ago. I told her I wasn't pushing anyone away. I was simply maintaining the boundaries that had already been established. I said if Alicia wanted a relationship with me, she'd had countless opportunities before she needed something. I said showing up with an apology when you need a favor isn't the same as showing up because you value someone. Renee said I was being stubborn and holding on to anger. I asked her if she'd read the wedding program. She said yes. I asked her if she'd noticed my name wasn't in it. She was quiet. I asked her if she thought that was an oversight or a decision. She didn't answer. I asked her if she thought I should make myself available to people who decided I wasn't worth acknowledging. She said family was complicated. I said yes, it was, and I was choosing to uncomplicate my life by removing myself from situations where I wasn't valued. She said I was going to die alone if I kept pushing people away. I told her I'd rather die alone with my dignity intact than live surrounded by people who only remembered I existed when they needed something from me. After we hung up, I sat with that truth. I was 73 years old. I didn't have infinite years left, and I wasn't willing to spend the ones I had the same way I'd spent the previous decades. I'd given enough. I'd sacrificed enough. I'd made myself small enough to accommodate other people's egos and needs and expectations. I was finished with all of it. Michael stopped speaking to me for 3 weeks. When he finally called, he said I was being stubborn and judgmental. He said family meant forgiving mistakes. I asked him if he'd forgiven the colleague who'd stolen credit for his work 5 years ago. He said that was different. I asked him how. He couldn't answer. I told him that respect was the foundation of every meaningful relationship, and once that foundation crumbled, you couldn't rebuild it by pretending the damage hadn't happened. I said Alicia and the Pattersons had made clear they didn't respect my contributions, and I was responding by removing my contributions from their lives. He said I was punishing them. I said no, I was protecting myself. There's a difference. The estate situation deteriorated. I heard through church members who knew the Pattersons that the family had hired a professional mediator who'd made things worse by approaching everything like a business transaction. Veronica had tried to handle negotiations herself and ended up alienating her own siblings. The case was heading to court, which meant legal fees that would consume a significant portion of whatever they were fighting over. Sister Jenkins mentioned it to me after service one Sunday. She said it was a shame how the Patterson family was tearing itself apart over money. She said she'd heard they'd tried to get me involved, but I'd declined. She looked at me with a question in her eyes that she was too polite to ask directly. I told her that I'd spent enough years helping other people solve their problems. She nodded slowly, understanding more than I'd said. Then she told me about her own experience stepping back from family obligations that had consumed her life for decades. She said it had taken her until she was 75 to realize that being needed and being valued weren't the same thing. She said the people who'd needed her most had appreciated her least, and once she understood that, she'd found peace in disappointing them. Her words validated something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. I wasn't being cruel by setting boundaries. I was finally understanding my own worth after a lifetime of letting other people define it. I ran into Veronica at the grocery store in September. She was coming out as I was going in. We saw each other at the same moment. She stopped. I kept walking. She called my name. I turned and waited. She asked if we could talk. I said I was on a schedule. She said the family was falling apart and she didn't know how to fix it. She said she'd made mistakes and she was sorry. She said she needed help from someone who understood how to bring people together. She said she was asking me, person to person, to please consider stepping in. I looked at this woman who'd spent months dismissing my input, erasing my contributions, and treating me like I was irrelevant. I looked at her standing in front of the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, desperate enough to approach someone she'd considered beneath her notice. I told her I understood family conflict was difficult. I told her professional mediators could be expensive and ineffective. I told her sometimes the cost of disrespecting people is that they're no longer available when you finally decide you need them. Then I went inside to do my shopping. The encounter stayed with me for days. There was a small, petty part of me that felt satisfaction in seeing Veronica desperate and diminished. But mostly, I felt tired. Tired of being the person everyone turned to in crisis. Tired of having my value recognized only when someone needed me to fix their problems. Tired of spending energy on people who'd never spent any on me. She sent flowers to my house the next week, an enormous arrangement of lilies and roses that must have cost $200. The card said, "Please reconsider. We need your wisdom and experience. With deepest respect, Veronica Patterson." I gave them to my neighbor, who mentioned they were beautiful and asked what the occasion was. I said someone was trying to purchase something that wasn't for sale. Alicia sent a letter. It arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday. 3 pages of handwritten apology, explaining how much she'd learned about family and respect and how badly she wanted to make things right. She said she understood why I was hurt. She said she didn't expect immediate forgiveness but hoped I'd be willing to consider rebuilding our relationship. She said, "Christopher deserved to know me." I read the letter twice. The writing was thoughtful, the sentiments seemingly genuine. But underneath the careful words, I could see the same pattern that had always existed. Alicia, reaching out because she needed something, not because she genuinely valued me all along. If the Patterson family wasn't in crisis, would she have written this letter? If Veronica didn't need a mediator, would Alicia have apologized? The timing told me everything I needed to know about the motivation. I filed the letter in my desk drawer with other correspondence I'd received over the years from people who'd discovered too late that my presence in their lives had meant something. I didn't respond. Words were easy. Actions over time were what mattered, and the actions over the past 2 years had been clear. The estate case went to court in November. From what I heard through church networks, the judge had been frustrated with all parties. The settlement was unfavorable to everyone involved, and family relationships that had survived decades were now permanently damaged. Veronica's sister stopped speaking to her. Her brother threatened to write her out of his own will. The family Christmas gathering was canceled for the first time in 40 years. I felt no satisfaction in hearing about their suffering. I'd mediated enough family conflicts to know how painful they were, how they damaged people in ways that lasted long after the money was divided. But I also knew that some lessons could only be learned through consequences, and the Patterson family was learning that relationships couldn't be repaired with the same casual dismissal that had broken them. I spent Christmas in Raleigh with Dorothy and her family. We cooked together, watched old movies, and sat around her dining room table telling stories about people we'd loved and lost. Dorothy's grandchildren asked me to teach them how to make my sweet potato pie, and I spent an afternoon in the kitchen with 3 young women who listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions and thanked me genuinely for sharing something I'd learned from my own grandmother. Nobody needed me to solve their problems. Nobody expected me to mediate their disputes. Nobody wanted anything from me except my company and whatever wisdom I chose to share. It was the most peaceful holiday I'd had in years. Renee came to visit in January. She sat in my living room and admitted she'd been wrong to pressure me about Alicia. She said she'd watched what happened with the Patterson family and understood now what I'd been trying to explain. She said she'd talked to Alicia, who was struggling with the reality that Veronica's need for control had cost her the one relationship that might have prevented everything from falling apart. I asked Renee if Alicia was okay. She said Alicia was managing, but that she'd finally started to understand the difference between being young and being careless with people who matter. I nodded. There wasn't much else to say. Michael called in February to apologize. He said he'd been thinking about the wedding program and the years since then, and he finally understood why I'd made the choices I'd made. He said he was proud of me for knowing my worth. I thanked him for saying so. Their support meant something, but it didn't change my position. I didn't reach out to Alicia. I didn't offer to help with the ongoing family tensions that continued to ripple through the Patterson clan. I simply continued living the life I'd built, full of pottery and book club and travel and friendships that didn't require me to prove my value repeatedly. Alicia sent pictures of Christopher on his first birthday. He was sitting in a high chair covered in cake, laughing at something outside the frame. I looked at those pictures for a long time. He had Alicia's eyes and her husband's smile and that pure joy that only very young children possess. I felt the ache of missing someone I barely knew, the grief of a relationship that would never exist. But I didn't regret my choices. Christopher would grow up hearing stories about his great-grandmother who'd set boundaries and lived with dignity. Maybe that would matter to him someday. Maybe he'd understand that love without respect isn't love at all. It's just need dressed up in prettier language. I put the pictures in a box with other memories I held carefully but at a distance. My wedding album, letters Thomas had written me during our courtship, photographs from when my children were young. These were pieces of a life I'd lived fully, relationships that had shaped me, moments that mattered. But they were the past, and I was learning to live in the present without constantly reaching back for things that no longer existed. Spring came to Richmond with its usual abundance. The azaleas bloomed in my yard, the same plants Thomas and I had put in the ground 30 years ago. I spent hours working in the garden, planting tomatoes and herbs, pruning roses, pulling weeds with a meditation I'd learned to appreciate. My hands in the soil, the sun on my face, the simple satisfaction of tending something that grew because I cared for it. This was enough. I am 71 years old now. I have lived long enough to understand that some silences speak louder than any confrontation ever could. I have learned that showing up for people doesn't obligate them to see you, and being needed doesn't mean you're valued. I have learned that the punishment for being taken for granted isn't anger or revenge. It's simply the quiet withdrawal of a presence people assumed would always be there. Veronica still lives in Richmond. The Patterson family still gathers, though less frequently and with more visible tension than before. Alicia raises her son with whatever wisdom she's gathered from watching relationships break under the weight of disrespect and assumption. I hear about them occasionally, the way you hear about people who used to be part of your daily life but now exist in some other orbit entirely. I don't wish them harm. I don't celebrate their struggles. I simply continue my life, surrounded by people who understand that respect isn't something you withhold until you need a favor, and that some doors, once closed, don't reopen just because you've finally decided to knock. My pottery has improved over the years. I've developed a style that's distinctly mine, simple forms with subtle variations in glaze that create unexpected beauty. I sell pieces at the church fundraiser and the community center's art show. People buy them and tell me they remind them of traditional work, but with something contemporary in the execution. I accept the compliments graciously and think about how long it took me to create something that was entirely my own, with no obligation to anyone else's vision. The book club continues meeting every other Wednesday. We've been reading more poetry lately. Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, Lucille Clifton, women who wrote about finding their voices, about surviving, about the particular strength required to live with dignity in a world that often denied it. I find myself in their words, in the spaces between what they say and what they mean. Diane and I take day trips together, to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, to Monticello, to small towns neither of us had explored before. We talk about everything and nothing. She tells me about her daughter, who still hasn't quite forgiven her for having a life beyond grandmothering. I tell her about Alicia, about the wedding program, about learning to live with the grief of a relationship that couldn't survive its own patterns. We understand each other in the way women our age do, having lived long enough to know that sometimes love means letting go, and that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Pastor Hollis retired last year. The new pastor, a woman named Reverend Mitchell, is young and energetic and full of ideas about community outreach and social justice. She asked me to serve on the planning committee for a new initiative helping formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society. I agreed because it interested me, because I believed in the mission, because it was work I chose rather than work I was expected to do. At our first meeting, she introduced me as someone with decades of experience in community building and conflict resolution. She acknowledged my contributions before I'd made them, created space for my input without assuming I'd give it, and thanked me genuinely for my time. It was such a small thing, basic respect, really, but it reminded me what it felt like to be valued rather than just needed. I still sit in the third pew on Sunday mornings, but I'm no longer the first person people call when things fall apart. I've become one voice among many, one presence in a larger community. I offer what I have when asked, but I no longer give until I'm empty. I've learned the difference between generosity and self-erasure. Sometimes I think about Alicia. I wonder if she understands yet what she lost, or if she's still telling herself that I'm the one being unreasonable. I wonder if Christopher will ask about me someday, if he'll want to know why his great-grandmother isn't in his life. I wonder what Alicia will tell him, whether she'll be honest about her role in our estrangement, or whether she'll paint me as the difficult old woman who held a grudge. It doesn't change my decision. I'm not holding a grudge. I'm holding a boundary. There's a difference that some people never learn to see. My health is good. I walk 3 miles most days, attend my pottery class twice a week, volunteer at the library on Tuesdays. I have dinner with Renee and her family regularly, visit Michael when he's in town for business. I've built a life that's smaller than it used to be, but more authentically mine. I wake up each morning knowing I don't have to prove my worth to anyone, don't have to earn my place, don't have to make myself useful to justify my existence. Last month, I donated 6 quilts to a charity auction benefiting a women's shelter. Each one took weeks to complete, hours of careful stitching and thoughtful design. They raised more than $3,000. My name was in the program, listed among the donors and artists who'd contributed. When the auctioneer held up the first quilt and described the work that went into it, people applauded. Someone I didn't know came up to me afterward and said she'd been moved by the beauty and craftsmanship, that she could tell each quilt had been made with love. I thought about the quilt I'd made for Christopher, how I'd poured the same care into something that was meant to connect me to a great-grandson I'd never hold. I thought about how that quilt represented everything I'd learned about giving, that you can offer something with love and still protect yourself by not expecting anything in return. They needed my experience. They needed my credibility. They needed my ability to see all sides and find common ground. They needed the very thing they'd spent years taking for granted. I was no longer available. And in that unavailability, in that simple absence, they learned what my presence had been worth all along. I sit in my living room now, in the green velvet chair that's faded to something softer over the years, and I feel at peace in a way I never did during all those decades of service. I've learned that you can love people and still remove them from your life. I've learned that protecting your dignity isn't the same as holding a grudge. I've learned that some relationships can't survive the weight of disrespect, no matter how much history they carry. I've learned that being needed and being valued are not the same thing. And I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is simply stop being available to people who took her availability for granted. The afternoon sun comes through my window, warming the room where I've spent so many quiet hours. My pottery wheel sits in the corner of my studio. My garden waits outside for spring planting. My calendar is full of activities I chose, friendships I've cultivated, commitments I made because they bring me joy rather than obligation. This is what 71 looks like when you've finally learned your own worth. This is what freedom feels like after a lifetime of service. This is what dignity looks like when you protect it instead of sacrificing it to keep peace with people who never valued it. I don't know what the rest of my years will bring, but I know they'll be mine, lived on my terms, surrounded by people who see me, filled with moments I choose rather than obligations I inherit. Alicia and Veronica and the Patterson family will continue their lives without my intervention. They'll resolve their conflicts, or they won't. They'll heal their relationships, or they'll let them fracture beyond repair. They'll learn from the consequences of their actions, or they'll repeat the same patterns with someone else. None of it requires anything from me. I gave 63 years of showing up. I gave my time, my energy, my wisdom, my presence. I gave until being overlooked became so familiar I almost didn't notice it anymore. Almost, but not quite. And in that small space of noticing, in that moment of clarity when I read a wedding program with my name erased from it, I found something I'd been missing for decades. The understanding that I deserved better than being invisible. So I made myself unavailable. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of simple self-preservation and long overdue self-respect. They can hire mediators and therapists and consultants. They can write letters and send flowers and show up at my door with apologies and babies and promises to do better. They can tell themselves I'm being stubborn or holding grudges or failing to forgive. None of it will change the fundamental truth. You cannot erase someone and then expect them to be there when you finally decide you need them. I was there for 63 years. They had every opportunity to value that presence while I was offering it freely. They chose not to. I'm simply respecting the choice they made. And I'm living my life, finally, fully, completely, as a woman who knows her worth and refuses to settle for anything less than being genuinely seen, respected, and valued. That's not revenge. That's dignity. And at 71, dignity is the only inheritance I'm interested in leaving behind. If this story moved you, don't leave without letting us know. Your likes, your comments, and your subscription aren't just buttons. They're the heartbeat of this community. They help these stories reach someone who might need them today. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Until the next one, stay strong, stay safe, and stay connected.